The last foghorn at Dunmore Point sounded on April 3rd of this year, 4 days after I disconnected the compressor, drained the air reservoir, and physically removed the diaphragm from the emitter housing. I was standing in the equipment room when it happened, holding the brass diaphragm plate in my hands, and the horn still sounded. Not the light, wavering note you might imagine from a broken system gasping its last. A full, deep, two-tone blast that rattled the windows of the keeper's quarters 200 meters away and sent the herring gulls screaming off the cliff face. I need to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a superstitious person. I spent 11 years in maritime navigation systems before I ever set foot on Dunmore Point. I've maintained fog signals from Cape Garda to the Belmont approaches. I understand how compressed air moves through a resonating chamber, how temperature gradients affect sound propagation, how acoustic reflections off cliff faces can make a horn seem to speak from somewhere it isn't. I know these things the way a surgeon knows anatomy, not as abstract knowledge, but as something my hands have learned. And I am telling you that what happened at Dunmore Point between January and April of this year does not fit inside any framework I possess. I should start properly. My name is Callum Breck, and I was employed by the Coastal Navigation Authority, the CNA, as a Grade 3 fog signal and optical systems technician. In January, I received a reassignment to Dunmore Point Light Station on the southwestern coast. The posting was unusual for several reasons. First, Dunmore Point was one of only 3 manned stations remaining in the CNA's jurisdiction. Most had been automated in the late 90s. Second, the reassignment came with no prior consultation. My supervisor at the regional maintenance hub simply told me one morning that I'd been moved, effective the following Monday. Third, and this is the part that troubled me most at the time, Dunmore Point had burned through 4 operators in 14 months. The official language was always benign: personal reasons, family circumstances, health concerns, voluntary resignation. But 4 people in just over a year at a station that had previously retained keepers for decades felt wrong. I asked about it. My supervisor said the isolation was harder than people expected. He said the accommodation was substandard and the CNA was planning renovations. He said a lot of things that added up to nothing, and then he said the salary uplift was 22%, and the posting came with an additional remote service allowance. I took the job. I had reasons of my own for wanting distance from everything I'd known. Dunmore Point sits on a promontory that juts out into open water like a broken finger. The lighthouse itself is a traditional round tower, white painted stone, 31 meters to the lantern gallery, built in 1887 and automated for light operation in 2003. The fog signal is older technology, a Type 4 compressed air diaphone installed in 1962, upgraded with electronic timing controls in 1994. It sits in a concrete housing about 40 meters from the base of the tower, connected to a compressor room by buried pipework. The sound it produces is extraordinary, a low-frequency blast followed by a descending grunt that carries for nautical miles in the right atmospheric conditions. My job, on paper, was maintenance. I was to ensure the continued operation of both the light and the fog signal, perform weekly systems checks, log weather observations for the Maritime Forecasting Network, and act as a visual lookout during periods of restricted visibility. Simple enough. I'd done similar work at automated stations during scheduled maintenance visits. The difference was that at Dunmore Point, I lived on site. The keeper's quarters were in a stone cottage about 200 meters back from the cliff edge. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a bathroom that had been updated sometime in the 80s and not touched since. It was adequate, not comfortable, but adequate. I arrived on a Monday in mid-January. The previous operator, a woman named Sandra Voss, had left her forwarding address with the regional office, but nothing else. No handover notes, no maintenance log entries for her final 3 weeks, no personal items. The cottage was clean in a way that felt deliberate, as if someone had wanted to leave no trace of themselves. The only evidence Sandra Voss had existed there at all was a small adhesive note stuck inside the door of the compressor room. It read, in careful block letters, "Check activation log against shipping register." I didn't know what to make of that at the time. I peeled the note off, put it in my jacket pocket, and began my familiarization checks. The first 2 weeks were unremarkable. The light operated on its automated cycle, a white flash every 15 seconds, visible for 24 nautical miles. The fog signal was controlled by a visibility sensor mounted on the cliff edge. When visibility dropped below a set threshold, the system activated the compressor and the horn would sound its pattern. 2 blasts every 60 seconds, each blast lasting 4 seconds. Simple, automatic, reliable. My role was to ensure the machinery remained in working order and to override the automation if conditions warranted it. February brought fog, thick, persistent banks of it that rolled in from the southwest and sat on the water for days at a time. The horn ran almost continuously through the first week of February, and I grew accustomed to its rhythm, that deep, two-tone sound becoming as natural as my own breathing, as unremarkable as the generator's hum. I performed my maintenance checks, logged my weather observations, read books in the evenings. The isolation was fine. I'd lived alone before. I preferred it, in some ways. It was on February 9th that something changed. I was in the compressor room performing a routine inspection of the air reservoir pressure when the horn activated. This was normal. The visibility sensor had been triggering it intermittently all morning as fog banks drifted across the headland. But this time, I noticed something in the activation log that the automated system records. The horn had sounded at 6:14, 6:15, 6:16, 6:17, 6:18, 6:19, and 6:20. 7 activations in 7 minutes. The program cycle was 1 activation per minute. The system should have been producing 1 2-blast pattern every 60 seconds. Instead, it had fired 7 times in 7 minutes, each activation logged as a separate event rather than part of the continuous cycle. I checked the visibility sensor output. It showed a steady reading well below the activation threshold, conditions that should have produced the normal continuous cycle, not individual discrete blasts. I checked the electronic timer. It showed no fault codes. I checked the compressor. Normal operating pressure. I ran a manual test cycle, and the system responded correctly. 1 pattern per minute, exactly as programmed. I noted the anomaly in my maintenance log and moved on. Equipment glitches happen. Sensors drift. Timers occasionally misbehave. It wasn't until 3 days later, on February 12th, that I received the weekly Maritime Incident Summary from the Regional Coordination Office and felt something cold settle in my chest. The summary reported that on February 9th, at approximately 0620 local time, a fishing vessel called the Ardent Pioneer had capsized and sunk in heavy seas approximately 40 nautical miles southwest of Dunmore Point. 7 crew members were aboard. All 7 had been lost. 7 activations. 7 dead. I sat with that for a long time. I sat with it the way you sit with a coincidence that is almost certainly a coincidence, but feels like something else. Something your rational mind won't name, but your body recognizes. I told myself it was meaningless. I told myself that fishing vessels operate in dangerous waters and people die at sea, and I was not a man who saw patterns in random events. I told myself all of this, and then I remembered Sandra Voss's note. Check activation log against shipping register. The shipping register, the formal record of vessel movements, incidents, and casualties maintained by the Maritime Authority, was not something I had direct access to from Dunmore Point. But the weekly incident summaries contained casualty figures, and my maintenance logs contained the Horn's activation records going back months. I began to cross-reference them. It took me 2 days. Sandra Voss had not left her own maintenance logs, but the automated system retained data regardless of whether anyone was present to read it. I pulled the activation records from November through January and compared them against the incident summaries I requested from the regional office, claiming I needed them for a fog signal performance review. The pattern was there. Not every time. The Horn activated normally most of the time, following its programmed cycle in response to reduced visibility, but interspersed with the normal operations were these anomalous clusters, discrete activations that broke the cycle, and every time they appeared within 24 hours, the casualty reports would follow. The number of anomalous blasts matched the number of dead, not approximately, exactly. November 14th, 3 anomalous blasts at 2207. November 15th, cargo vessel Meridian Coast reported 3 crew swept overboard in a storm. All 3 lost. December 2nd, 1 anomalous blast at 0341. December 2nd, solo yachtsman found dead aboard his vessel, cause undetermined. December 19th, 11 anomalous blasts between 1400 and 1403. December 19th, passenger ferry Island Crown suffered a catastrophic engine room fire. 11 fatalities. I found 9 incidents across 3 months. The correlation was perfect. Not a single anomalous activation existed without a corresponding death. Not a single maritime death had occurred in the region without the Horn marking it first. The Horn was counting the dead before they died. I need to describe what this knowledge did to me because I think it matters. I did not panic. I did not call my supervisor and demand an explanation. I did not flee. What I did was something that I recognize now as deeply irrational, but which felt at the time like the only sane response. I began to watch the system more carefully. I began to listen. I moved a camp bed into the compressor room. I set up a secondary recording system, just a basic audio logger connected to a microphone mounted on the horn housing, so I would have an independent record of every activation. I began checking the activation log every hour, then every 30 minutes. I started keeping my own handwritten record alongside the electronic one because I no longer fully trusted the automated system to tell me the truth about itself. February wore on. The fog continued. The horn sounded its normal cycle, and twice more I caught the anomalous clusters. February 16th, 5 discrete blasts. February 17th, fishing vessel Coral Star lost with all 5 hands in deteriorating conditions off the Blackmore Banks. February 23rd, 2 blasts at 04:55. February 23rd, 2 recreational divers reported missing near Gallows Reef. Bodies recovered the following day. I was now certain beyond any reasonable doubt that the pattern was real, but certainty brought no comfort, because certainty demanded that I answer the next question. Was the horn predicting these deaths, or was it causing them? The distinction matters. If the horn was simply registering some foreknowledge, detecting some approaching event through mechanisms I couldn't understand, then it was a warning system, terrifying, inexplicable, but ultimately passive. But if the horn was somehow precipitating the deaths, if its anomalous sounding was not a prediction, but an instruction, a summoning, a signal to something in the water, then by maintaining it, by keeping it operational, I was complicit. I began to research the station's history. The CNA's archives were limited, mostly maintenance records and personnel files, but the Regional Library Service could access older maritime records through an interlibrary loan system. I requested everything they had on Dunmore Point. What came back over the following 2 weeks assembled itself into something I didn't want to see. The Dunmore Point fog signal had been installed in 1962, replacing a manually operated bell system. Prior to 1962, the station used a large bronze bell struck by a clockwork mechanism during periods of poor visibility. That bell had been in continuous service since the Lighthouse was built in 1887. And here is what caught my attention. In the 75 years the bell was in service, there were no recorded maritime fatalities within 50 nautical miles of Dunmore Point. Not one. The waters around the headland, known locally as the Dunmore Approaches, had been considered among the safest in the region. Vessels that use the sound of the bell to navigate in fog invariably reach port safely. After 1962, after the diaphone was installed, the fatality rate in the Dunmore Approaches began to climb. Slowly at first, a death here, a capsizing there. By the 1980s, the waters around Dunmore Point had some of the highest casualty figures in the entire CNA jurisdiction. The Maritime Authority attribute this to increased traffic, changing weather patterns, the decline of traditional seamanship. Nobody connected it to the fog signal itself, but I found something else in the archived records. A letter dated March 1963 from the first keeper to serve at Dunmore Point after the new signal was installed. His name was Arthur Prade, and he'd written to the Lighthouse Board, the CNA's predecessor organization, requesting an immediate meeting to discuss what he called unacceptable irregularities in the fog signal's autonomous behavior. The letter was stamped received, but there was no record of any response, no record of any meeting, no follow-up correspondence. Arthur Prade served at Dunmore Point for another 27 years. He never wrote to the board again. He never requested a transfer. He never filed a formal complaint. But his maintenance logs, which I accessed through the archived records, contained a detail that made my skin prickle. Every month, without exception, he recorded the total number of anomalous activations, just a number written in the margin of his logbook. And beside it, every month, the same annotation, confirmed. He'd known. For 27 years, he'd known. I tried to find Arthur Prade. The personnel records showed he'd retired in 1990 and his pension payments had ceased in 2004, presumably the year he died. I found no family listed, no next of kin. He'd spent 27 years living alone on Dunmore Point, counting the dead, and then he died alone somewhere else. That was the whole of his story, as far as the records could tell me. But it wasn't the whole of the story at Dunmore Point, because when I looked more carefully at the staffing records, I noticed something else. After Arthur Prade retired, the station went through keepers at an accelerating rate. 2 years, 18 months, 14 months, 8 months, 6 months. The tenures grew shorter and shorter. The reasons for departure were always vague. And in 2003, when the light was automated and the station was reduced to a single maintenance operator, the pattern accelerated further. The 4 operators in 14 months before me were just the latest in a long sequence of people who came to Dunmore Point and could not stay. I understood why. The knowledge was unbearable, not because it was frightening, although it was, but because it demanded a response. Every time the horn sounded its anomalous blasts, you knew people were about to die. You knew the number. You knew the approximate location and timing, and you could do nothing with that knowledge. You couldn't call the Coast Guard and say, 7 people are going to die at sea tomorrow morning. I know, because my foghorn told me. You'd be removed from your post, assessed for mental fitness, and quietly discharged. The system, the institution, had no capacity to receive this information, and so the keepers left. One by one, they reached the limit of what they could bear, and they walked away, because walking away was the only response available to someone who could not act, and could not remain silent, and could not be heard. But I didn't leave. I stayed because I became obsessed with the other question, the one I'd asked earlier. Was the horn predicting, or was it causing? Because if it was causing, then there was something I could do. I could stop it. In early March, I began conducting experiments. I disconnected the automatic trigger so the horn would only sound when I manually activated it. The visibility sensor still functioned, the light still operated normally, but the fog signal fell silent. For 3 days, nothing happened. No anomalous activations because the system was disconnected, and no deaths at sea in the Dunmore approaches. Nothing. The waters were quiet. On the 4th day, I reconnected the system. Within 6 hours, the horn produced an anomalous cluster, 4 discrete blasts at 11:22. The next morning's incident summary reported a cargo vessel grounding with 4 crew fatalities off Dunmore Head. I disconnected the system again immediately. This time I left it disconnected for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, not a single vessel was lost in the Dunmore approaches. The weather was foul, heavy fog, high seas, exactly the conditions that historically preceded casualties, but no one died. The Regional Coordination Office even noted it in their weekly summary as an unusual period of safe passage in what was normally a high-risk area. I was shaking when I read that. I mean, physically shaking, because it meant the horn was not predicting, it was causing. Every anomalous blast was not a forecast, but a sentence. The horn spoke, and then the sea killed. It had been doing this since 1962, 63 years. How many hundreds of people had died because a diaphone was installed at Dunmore Point? How many vessels had gone down in waters that had been perfectly safe for 3/4 of a century before that? And I could stop it. I had stopped it. All I had to do was keep the horn disconnected. Except, there's always an except. On March 19th, my supervisor called. A routine check had revealed that the Dunmore Point fog signal had not been transmitting its operational confirmation signal to the monitoring network. Was there a fault? Did I need an engineer dispatched? I told him I'd identified an intermittent compressor issue and had taken the system offline for investigation. He accepted this for the moment, but he told me to file a fault report and gave me a timeline. The signal needed to be operational within 7 days, or he'd send a maintenance team. I filed the fault report. I described a fictional problem with the air reservoir pressure regulation that would require parts to be ordered. I bought myself 3 weeks, but I knew it was temporary. The CNA would not tolerate an inactive fog signal indefinitely. The system existed within a regulatory framework. Maritime safety legislation required active fog signals at designated stations. If I couldn't provide a legitimate reason for its silence, they would send someone to fix it, and then it would start again. I considered my options. I could resign, as all the others had done, walk away, let the next person discover the truth, or not discover it, and let the horn resume its killing. I could destroy the equipment, sabotage the compressor, damage the horn housing, make the system genuinely inoperable. But the CNA would simply replace it. They'd install new equipment, probably more modern equipment, and there was no guarantee the replacement wouldn't carry the same property. Whatever made the Dunmore Point signal lethal might not be in the machinery at all. It might be in the location, in the headland itself, in whatever the sound traveled through, the air, the water, the rock. Or I could try to understand it. I went back to the archives. I went further back than Arthur prayed, further back than the diaphone installation. I went all the way back to 1887, to the construction of the lighthouse itself, and then further still to the records that preceded the lighthouse. Dunmore Point had not always been a navigation aid site. Before 1887, it was simply a headland, unremarkable from a maritime perspective, neither particularly dangerous nor particularly useful as a landmark. The decision to build a lighthouse there had been made by the Lighthouse Board following a survey in 1884, and the survey report still existed in the archived records. I found it on microfiche through the Regional Library Service. The 1884 survey noted something peculiar about Dunmore Point. The headland produced a natural acoustic phenomenon, a resonance that occurred during certain wind conditions when air was forced through fissures in the cliff face. The survey team described it as a deep, regular tone of considerable volume, audible at a distance of several miles at sea, and bearing resemblance to the sounding of a fog signal. They recommended the site for lighthouse construction specifically because vessels were already using the natural sound as a navigation reference. the natural sound. The headland itself had been making a noise that vessels used for safe navigation. And in the 75 years that the bronze bell accompanied it, the waters remained safe. The bell and the natural resonance worked together. Ships heard them and survived. But the diaphone was different. The diaphone didn't accompany the natural sound. It replaced it. The concrete housing, the buried pipework, the compressor room, all of it had been built directly over the cliff fissures that produced the natural resonance. The construction had sealed them, blocked them, silenced the headland's own voice, and substituted a mechanical one. And whatever had been speaking through those fissures, whatever had been keeping vessels safe for centuries or millennia before any lighthouse existed, had been trapped, sealed beneath concrete, left with only one remaining outlet, the diaphone itself, the compressed air system that sat directly above the blocked fissures, the horn that drew air from the same geological structure that had once produced the protective sound. But the sound it produced now was not protective. It was the opposite. It was the voice of something suffocating, something enraged, something that had been keeping sailors alive and was now being used, forced, to mark their deaths instead. Every anomalous blast was not the horn speaking. It was the thing beneath the horn screaming through the only aperture left to it. And when it screamed, people died, not because it wanted them dead, but because its natural frequency, its protective resonance, had been inverted, compressed, distorted, turned into something lethal by the very system designed to amplify it. The diaphone wasn't a weapon. It was a cage, and the thing inside was not malevolent. It was drowning. I understood then why Arthur Prade had stayed for 27 years. He'd known. He'd understood that leaving changed nothing, and that the system would continue regardless of who was present. He'd stayed because proximity to the horror was the only form of witness available. And I understood why Sandra Voss had left her note, not as a warning, but as a test. She wanted to know if the next person would see it, would understand it, would stay. But I was not Arthur Prade. I was not willing to spend decades counting the dead. And I was not Sandra Voss, passing the burden to the next keeper. I was going to end it. On March 28th, I began dismantling the fog signal system, not subtly, not covertly. I disconnected the compressor from the air reservoir. I drained the reservoir. I unbolted the diaphragm plate from the emitter housing and removed it entirely. I disconnected the electrical supply to the timing system. I removed the visibility sensor from its mounting on the cliff edge. I did everything short of demolishing the concrete housing itself, which would have required equipment I didn't have. I filed no fault report. I made no explanation. I simply dismantled the system and waited. 3 days later, on March 31st, my supervisor called. The monitoring network showed the fog signal as completely offline. No operational confirmation, no fault codes, nothing. What was happening? I told him the truth, parts of it. I told him the fog signal was fundamentally compromised and could not be safely operated. I told him I'd identified what I believed was a structural defect in the horn housing that made the system unreliable. I told him I'd taken it offline, pending a full engineering review. He was unhappy, but he agreed to send an engineering team the following week. On April 1st, I did something I hadn't done before. I went to the compressor room at night. I went because I wanted to listen. With the machinery silent, with the horn disassembled, I wanted to hear whether the headland still had a voice. I stood in the dark, in the concrete room that had been built over the cliff fissures 63 years ago, and I listened. At first, nothing. The sound of the sea, the wind, my own breathing, and then, faint, almost below the threshold of hearing, a vibration, not in the air but in the floor, in the concrete itself, a low, rhythmic pulse that I felt in the bones of my feet before I heard it with my ears. It was there, beneath me, still alive, still trying to speak. 63 years of being sealed under concrete and machinery, and it was still there, still pulsing its ancient frequency into rock that could no longer carry it to the surface. I knelt down and pressed my palms flat to the concrete floor. The vibration was stronger through direct contact, a deep, slow pulse, maybe one cycle every 4 or 5 seconds. Patient, impossibly patient. It didn't feel angry. It felt, and I know how this sounds, it felt like something waiting, something that had been waiting for 63 years for someone to open the cage. I made a decision that night. I know it was irrational. I know it violated every professional standard I'd ever held, but I also know, with the certainty that comes from having counted the dead, that the machinery above the fissures was killing people, and that the thing below had once kept them alive, and that the cage had to be opened. I couldn't demolish the concrete housing, not alone. But I could break the seal. The compressor room floor had been poured directly over the natural rock, and in places, particularly around the edges where the walls met the floor, the concrete had cracked over decades of thermal cycling and salt exposure, hairline fractures, structural weaknesses, places where, if someone were determined enough, a heavy tool could widen the gap. I worked through the night of April 1st and the days of April 2nd and 3rd. I used a cold chisel and a 4-pound hammer from the maintenance workshop. I opened 3 cracks in the floor, each about a meter long, each widened to perhaps 2 centimeters, not enough to compromise the structural integrity of the room, but enough to let air pass, enough to let sound escape. And on April 3rd, at approximately 14:30, as I stood in the compressor room, holding the removed diaphragm plate in my hands, the horn sounded. Not the mechanical horn. I'd disassembled that. The building itself sounded. The air moving through the cracks I'd opened, passing through the structure above, resonating in the empty horn housing, produced a sound. A deep, full, 2-tone blast. The same frequency as the diaphone, but different, warmer, fuller, less mechanical, more like breath than machine. The concrete housing had become the fissure. The empty horn housing had become the resonating chamber. The thing beneath had found its voice again. I dropped the diaphragm plate and stood absolutely still as the sound faded. The gulls were screaming. The windows of the cottage were rattling in their frames. And then silence. Not the dead silence of a disconnected system, but the living silence of something that has spoken and is now listening for a response. I walked outside. The afternoon was clear. No fog. Good visibility. The sea was calm. And out on the water, maybe 3 miles offshore, I could see a small vessel, a fishing boat, heading northeast toward the harbor at Carrickmore. It was following the headland, using the sound to navigate the same way vessels had for centuries before the lighthouse was built. The horn sounded again, one long blast, The tone was different now, not the warning pattern of the diaphone, but something else. Something I can only describe as directional. It wasn't sounding outward in all directions. It was speaking to that vessel specifically, guiding it. The fishing boat adjusted its course, slightly to port, away from the submerged rocks off the headland's northern edge. I watched it pass safely through the Dunmore approaches and continue northeast until it was out of sight. The engineering team arrived on April 7th, 3 technicians in a CNA van with a replacement compressor and a new diaphragm assembly. I met them in the car park and walked them down to the compressor room. I had not repaired the cracks in the floor. I had not attempted to conceal what I'd done. The room was as I'd left it. Machinery disconnected, floor opened, the horn housing empty. The lead technician, a man named Garrett, whose face I remember as perpetually skeptical, looked at the scene for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "What happened to the floor?" I told him the truth. All of it. The activation logs, the correlation with casualties, the history, the fissures, the natural resonance. I showed him my records, the cross-referenced data, the archived documents, the 1884 survey report. I showed him everything. He listened. He looked at the data. He walked around the room, knelt beside the cracks, placed his hand on the floor the same way I had done. Then he stood up and looked at his 2 colleagues and said nothing for what felt like a very long time. "You know we have to report this," he said. "I know. They'll probably sack you. I know that too." He stood there a moment longer. Then he said, "The activation log data, the correlation, you verified this?" "Multiple times, 9 incidents across 3 months, perfect correspondence. And when the system was disconnected, 0 casualties in conditions that historically produced them." He nodded slowly. "You understand that if we reinstall the equipment, people will die?" "Yes." Garrett looked at his colleagues again. One of them, a younger woman whose name I never learned, was staring at the cracks in the floor with an expression I recognized. It was the expression I'd worn 3 weeks earlier, the expression of someone whose rational framework is failing under the weight of evidence. "We're going to report a structural failure," Garrett said. "Major ground subsidence beneath the compressor housing, unsafe for equipment installation pending geological survey." He looked at me. "That buys time. Months, maybe. But eventually someone above us will authorize the work anyway." "Unless the geological survey finds what I think it'll find," I said, "that the fissures beneath this building are an active geological feature, that any construction over them creates resonance interference, that the site is unsuitable for mechanical fog signal equipment, and the natural sound. It's already working. Listen." We stood in silence, and after perhaps 30 seconds, the building breathed. The low, warm tone, barely audible inside the room, but carrying far out to sea, moved through the cracks in the floor and up through the empty housing. Garrett felt it. I could see him feeling it. His hand went flat against the wall, instinctively seeking the vibration. "Christ," he said quietly. "The geological survey was commissioned in late April. I don't know the results yet. They haven't been published. But I do know that in the 6 weeks since I opened the cracks in the compressor room floor, there have been no maritime casualties in the Dunmore approaches. 0. The waters are safe again for the first time in 63 years. Vessels report hearing a low-frequency tone off Dunmore Point in conditions of restricted visibility, a sound that the CNA has not been able to identify or explain since no mechanical fog signal is currently operational at the station. I'm still here. I haven't been sacked. Garrett's report described a legitimate structural issue, and the CNA seems content to leave the station unmanned pending survey results. I'm officially on administrative leave, but no one has asked me to vacate the cottage. I think they've forgotten about me, or chosen not to think about me. It's the kind of institutional convenience that bureaucracies are built on. Every day I go to the compressor room and I listen. The tone comes and goes, stronger in fog, quieter in clear weather, louder when the wind blows from the southwest. It sounds like what it is, something ancient and patient and deeply, permanently awake. Something that protects. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's geological or biological or something else entirely. I don't need to know. I only need to know that it's working. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. The thing I haven't told Garrett or anyone else. The thing that Sandra Voss may have known and Arthur Prade certainly did. On the night of April 1st, when I was opening the cracks in the floor, working alone in the dark with my chisel and hammer, the vibration beneath me changed. It had been that slow, patient pulse, one cycle every 4 or 5 seconds. But as I worked, as the first crack widened enough for air to pass through, the pulse quickened, not dramatically, not suddenly, but perceptibly, from every 5 seconds to every 4, then every 3. I interpreted this as eagerness, as anticipation, something trapped for 6 decades feeling the first breath of freedom. But now, weeks later, in the quiet hours of the morning, when the headland is still, and I can feel that vibration through the floor of the cottage 200 meters away, I'm not sure eagerness is the right word, because the pulse is still quickening. It was every 5 seconds in January, every 3 seconds in early April. And now, it's continuous, not a pulse anymore, a hum, a constant, unbroken tone that I feel in every surface of this headland, in the walls, in the glass, in the water pipes, in my own teeth when I clench my jaw. The thing beneath Dunmore Point was sleeping when it was caged, dormant, running at the barest minimum of its capacity, enough to protect, but no more. The diaphone didn't just silence it, it throttled it, kept it contained, kept it small, and I opened the cage. What's coming through now is more than what was there before 1962, more than what the 1884 survey team heard, more than what kept vessels safe for centuries. The survey team described a tone audible at several miles. Fishermen last week reported hearing it at 12 miles, and growing. I don't think it's malevolent. I have to believe, that it protects, that its nature is protection. But I also believe that I don't know what it protects, or what it's protecting against, or what it needs to be so much louder now than it was before. I broke the seal, and something is waking up. Not slowly, as I thought, quickly. And what Arthur Prade knew, what I think Sandra Voss suspected, is that the diaphone was never just a cage. It was a valve. The last entry in Arthur Prade's maintenance log, dated June 1990, the month he retired, reads, "Resonance stable, containment adequate, must not be removed, must not be opened, God help whoever doesn't understand. I understand now. I understand too late. The thing beneath Dunmore Point isn't what's dangerous. What's dangerous is what it was holding back. The diaphone wasn't trapping a protector. It was trapping a barrier, a signal so powerful that it kept something else, something further out, something deeper down, from approaching the coast. And when the barrier's frequency was caged and distorted, it could no longer hold. Its inverted signal became a summons instead of a ward. People died not because the thing beneath was killing them, but because the thing beyond was being called. And now I've opened the barrier. I've let it wake. I've let it grow. And it's growing because it needs to, because something is coming and it knows. It has always known. The protective resonance is getting louder because the thing it protects against is getting closer. I can feel it at night, not beneath me anymore, but out there, in the water, in the deep, dark space beyond where the headland's light can reach. Something that the natural frequency of Dunmore Point has been holding at bay for longer than human memory. Something that 63 years of mechanical distortion has been slowly, inexorably inviting inward. The tone is at 12 miles now. Last night, standing on the cliff edge, I heard something answer it. From out past the continental shelf, from the deep water, a sound that wasn't a foghorn and wasn't a whale and wasn't any vessel I've ever heard in 11 years of maritime service. A low, sliding note that rose from beneath the surface of the sea and hung in the air for 9 seconds before fading. The headland's hum intensified immediately. I felt it through the soles of my boots, through the rock, up through my legs and into my spine. It was pushing back, holding the line, doing what it had always done, keeping the coast safe. But it was straining. I could feel the strain the way you can feel a rope pulled to its limit, taut, vibrating, almost at its breaking point. I don't know what happens if it breaks. I don't know what crosses the line if the barrier falls. I only know that for 63 years the barrier was weakened, and now it's awake. But so is the thing it was keeping out, and the mathematics of that contest, the ancient geological mathematics of resonant frequency against approaching mass, don't look good. I've written to the CNA. I've written to Garrett. I've written to everyone I can think of. I've told them, do not reinstall the equipment. Do not block the fissures. Do not interfere with the natural resonance. Let it do what it needs to do. Let it be as loud as it needs to be. No one has responded. And every night, the answering sound from the deep is a little closer, a little louder, a little longer. 9 seconds on April 3rd, 12 seconds on April 20th, 17 seconds last night. The headland is humming at a frequency I can feel in my fillings now. Constant, deafening if you press your ear to any stone surface. Growing, trying to be enough. I don't know if it will be enough. But I'm staying, not because I can do anything, not because my presence changes the calculus, but because someone has to be here to hear it. Someone has to witness whether the barrier holds or breaks. Someone has to know what happens next, so that if it fails, if the sound from the deep crosses the line and reaches the shore, there's at least one record, one testimony, one person who understood what Dunmore Point was and what it was doing and why it needed to keep singing. The foghorn never predicted death. It was never that simple. It was the sound of something trying to protect us, being twisted into a weapon against us, and now freed, but perhaps too late. I can hear both sounds as I write this. The headland beneath me, vast, ancient, rising toward a frequency my body can barely contain. And the answer from the deep, patient, approaching, testing the boundary with each passing night. If you live on this coast, if you can hear the tone, be glad. It means the barrier is still holding. It means Dunmore Point is still singing. If the sound stops, leave. Don't pack. Don't wait. Don't look toward the water. Just leave. That's what I wrote 3 weeks ago. I left it there, the last line of a document I'd been composing on the station's ancient desktop terminal, the one connected to nothing, backed up to nothing, existing only on a hard drive in the cottage's back bedroom. I wrote it as a statement of finality, an ending, a warning delivered to no one because I had no audience, no mechanism for distribution, no one left who would read it and understand. But the story didn't end there. Stories don't end because you decide they should. On April 28th, Garrett called, not through official channels, not through the CNA switchboard or the maintenance coordination line. He called my personal mobile, the number I'd given him when the engineering team visited. His voice was different, quieter. He spoke the way people speak when they're standing somewhere they shouldn't be, or when they're afraid of being overheard. Breck, he said, the geological survey team, they went down. I asked what he meant. He said the survey had been commissioned to examine the fissure system beneath the compressor room. Standard procedure, ground penetrating, radar, borehole cameras, acoustic mapping. 3 geologists from the Coastal Infrastructure Assessment Group, a subcontractor the CNA uses for structural surveys. They'd arrived at Dunmore Point on April 22nd, 6 days before Garrett's call. While I was in Carrickmore buying supplies, I hadn't known they'd come. No one told me. I'd been on administrative leave. Technically, the station wasn't my responsibility anymore. But when I returned from Carrickmore that evening, I found their van in the car park, equipment cases stacked by the compressor room door, and a note on the cottage's kitchen table that read, "Survey team on site, working overnight. No access to compressor housing until further notice." I didn't see them. I assumed they were working through the night. Geological surveys often run on extended shifts to capture continuous data sets. I went to bed. In the morning, the van was still there, but the equipment cases had been moved inside the compressor room and the door was closed. I knocked. No answer. I tried the handle. Locked. From the inside. I assumed they'd locked up to secure their equipment and gone for a walk, or driven to Carrickmore for breakfast. I went about my day. The van was still there at noon, still there at 3, still there at 6. No sign of anyone. At 8 o'clock that evening, I called the CNA regional office. I told them the survey team appeared to have left their vehicle and equipment on site, but I couldn't locate them. The duty officer said he'd check with the contractor. He called back 40 minutes later and said the team hadn't checked in with their office either. He said this was unusual, but not unprecedented. Survey teams in remote locations sometimes had communications difficulties. He asked me to check again in the morning. By morning, the door to the compressor room was open, not unlocked. Open, wide open, the way it hadn't been since I'd dismantled the fog signal equipment in March. I could feel the headland's resonance pouring out of it from 20 meters away, a physical sensation like walking into a wall of low-frequency pressure. I went inside. Their equipment was still there. 3 hard-sided cases, a ground-penetrating radar unit on its wheeled mount, 2 laptops on a folding table, a borehole camera kit still in its carrying case, coffee cups, 3 of them still half full, cold, with a faint skin of mold beginning to form on the surface. They'd been there for days. Nobody had drunk from them in days. The cracks in the floor, the ones I'd opened, were wider. Not significantly, not dramatically, but measurably wider. I'd opened them to perhaps 2 centimeters. They were now 4 or 5. And there were new ones. Hairline fractures radiating outward from the original 3, spiderwebbing across the concrete in a pattern that looked, and I know this is impossible, deliberate, organized, like the concrete was being parted along lines that had always existed invisibly within it. I found one of the laptops still powered on, its screen dark but responsive when I touched the trackpad. The survey software was open. A cross-sectional image of the ground beneath the compressor room filled the screen, the kind of false color rendering that GPR systems produce, showing density variations in the subsurface material. I am not a geologist. I don't read these images with fluency, but I understood enough to recognize that what I was looking at was wrong. The fissure system beneath the compressor room, the natural channels in the rock that I'd assumed were standard geological features, the kind of thing you'd find in any coastal cliff formation, extended downward far further than any natural fissure should. The GPR had mapped them to its maximum penetration depth of 30 meters, and at 30 meters they were still going, not narrowing, not terminating, widening, opening into something the GPR couldn't resolve because it was beyond the equipment's range. And the walls of the fissures, at depth, were not rough, not natural fracture surfaces. They were smooth, regular. The false color rendering showed them as uniform density, uniform temperature, uniform. I don't have the technical vocabulary, but I know what manufactured looks like compared to geological. I've seen enough of both to know the difference. The fissures below Dunmore Point are not geological formations. They are constructed. Something built them. Something bored them into the rock with a precision that no natural process could produce. That was what Garrett told me on the phone, 3 days after I'd found this myself. He'd received a preliminary data dump from the survey team before they disappeared. Automatic uploads from their equipment to the contractor's cloud server. He'd seen the same images I had, and he'd seen something else, an acoustic recording the team had made by lowering a microphone into the widest of the original fissures. "I need you to listen to something," he said, "and I need you to tell me what you hear." He sent me an audio file. I played it on my phone, standing in the car park at Dunmore Point, with the headland humming beneath my feet and the gray April sea stretching out to the horizon. The recording lasted 47 seconds. For the first 12 seconds, it was just ambient noise, the hollow rush of air moving through a narrow space, the kind of sound you'd expect from a microphone lowered into a vertical shaft. Then, at the 13-second mark, something else. Not the headland's resonance. I know that frequency. I know it the way I know my own heartbeat. This was different. Higher. More complex. Multiple tones layered on top of each other. in a pattern that was almost musical, a progression, a sequence that repeated and built and repeated and built, each iteration adding something new, something more intricate, like a language being spoken very slowly, each word taking seconds to unfold. And beneath it, beneath all of it, the headland's low tone, constant, unwavering, but at a frequency I hadn't heard before, lower than what comes through the cracks in the compressor room, lower than what I feel through the cottage floor, a frequency so deep it was more felt than heard. And what I felt was pressure, enormous directional pressure, pushing outward, pushing down. "Do you hear it?" Garrett asked. "Which part?" "The pattern, the higher sound, the layered one." "Yes." "That's coming from below, from whatever's at the bottom of the fissures, from whatever the GPR couldn't reach." I didn't say anything. The recording had ended. I was standing in the car park with dead air on the line, and the wind off the sea, and the headland singing beneath me, and I was thinking about the 1884 survey team who had heard the headland's voice and thought it was just a natural acoustic phenomenon, just wind through rock, just physics. And I was thinking about how wrong they were, how wrong we all were, because what I just heard in that recording was not wind through rock. It was not physics. It was not natural. It was a response. It was answer. It was a voice replying to the one I'd freed. "The survey team," I said. "Garrett, where are they?" Silence on the line. "Garrett, we don't know," he said. "Their van's still there. Their equipment's still there. The Coast Guard searched the cliff base and the surrounding area. Nothing. No bodies. No evidence of anything. They're just gone." "They went down," I said. I didn't mean it as a question. "The borehole camera kit was deployed," he said carefully. "The cable was extended to its full length, 40 meters, and then cut, not at the surface, about 3 meters below the floor level. Something cut it below ground." I was quiet for a long time. "Breck," Garrett said, "I'm coming to Dunmore Point tomorrow. I'm going to bring equipment to seal those fissures, industrial resin, enough to fill every crack in that floor and seal it permanently." "You can't," I said. "I'm not going to let whatever's down there. If you seal the fissures," I said, "you seal the barrier. You trap the resonance below the surface. You do exactly what the diaphone did in 1962. And then the deep sound, the one from out past the shelf, nothing will be holding it back. And if I don't seal them, people go down those holes and don't come back." He was right. We were both right. That was the horror of it. The fissures had to stay open for the barrier to function. But open fissures meant access, meant something could reach up from below, or people could be drawn down. The system only worked if it was tended, if someone was there to keep people away from the openings while the sound poured out of them. A guardian, a keeper. "Prayed," I said. 27 years. "What?" "Arthur prayed, the keeper who stayed for 27 years after the diaphone was installed. He wasn't just counting the dead, he was keeping people away from the machinery, from what was underneath. He stayed because someone had to make sure no one went looking. And now the machinery's gone, and the fissures are open, and 3 geologists went looking. Yes." Garrett came the next day. He didn't bring resin. He brought a padlock, industrial grade, hardened steel, and we secured the compressor room door. We drove steel stakes into the ground around the building and strung hazard tape between them. We posted warning signs, structural instability, danger of collapse, no entry. It felt absurd, bureaucratic, like putting a plaster on a wound that goes all the way through. But it was what we had. He stayed the night in the cottage. We didn't talk much. He ate the food I cooked and drank the tea I made and sat in the kitchen listening to the headland's resonance, the way you'd listen to a storm, with that particular combination of awe and dread that comes from proximity to something vast and indifferent. At 2 a.m, he woke me. He was standing in the hallway in his socks, his face pale in the light from the kitchen. "Can you hear that?" he said. I could. Not the headland. Not the low, constant hum I'd grown accustomed to. Something else, coming from outside, from the direction of the cliffs. We went out together. The night was clear. No fog, good visibility, the stars out, the sea visible as a dark plain stretching to the horizon. The lighthouse beam swept overhead every 15 seconds, painting the headland in white light and then releasing it back to darkness. The sound was coming from the compressor room, through the locked door, through the concrete walls, out into the night. The layered sound, the one from the recording, the multiple tones building on each other in their slow, complex progression, but louder now, much louder than it had been on the recording, loud enough to hear at 200 meters. And from the sea, answering it, the other sound, the one I'd first heard on April 3rd, the low sliding note from beyond the shelf. But it wasn't a single note anymore. It was layered too, complex, structured in the same way the sound from the fissures was structured, the same progression, the same pattern, the same language. They were talking to each other. The thing below Dunmore Point and the thing in the deep water were talking. The barrier frequency, the protective hum, was still there, still constant, still pushing outward. But the other sounds were moving through it, over it, around it, like two people having a conversation across a wall that neither of them acknowledges. "How long?" Garrett said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Since I opened the cracks. Maybe since always. I don't know." And the barrier, the protective frequency, it's separate from this? I think so. I think the barrier is automatic, geological, like an immune response. But the intelligence, whatever's in those fissures, I think that's something else. Something that uses the barrier, but isn't the barrier. And it's talking to whatever's out there. Yes. He was quiet. The sounds continued. The layered exchange from below and the layered response from the sea. Both building, both growing more complex with each repetition. The headland's constant hum holding between them like a membrane, like a skin stretched between two pressing forces. Maybe it's not adversarial, Garrett said. Maybe the barrier isn't keeping something out. Maybe it's keeping something apart. I looked at him. In the sweep of the lighthouse beam, his face was drawn, strange, lit white, and then gone. "Keeping two things apart," he said. "Two things that want to reach each other. Two things that have been trying to reach each other for how long? Since before the lighthouse. Since before any human structure on this headland. Since before humans. The fissures in the rock were constructed. The GPR showed that clearly. Built by something, bored into the headland's body by something that was trying to get closer to the surface, closer to the sea, closer to whatever lived in the deep water beyond the shelf, and the barrier frequency, the natural resonance that the headland had always produced. Maybe it wasn't produced by the headland at all. Maybe it was the headland. Maybe Dunmore Point itself was the barrier, the physical substance of the rock, resonating at a frequency that kept two things separated. Not a lighthouse, not a navigation aid, a wall, an ancient geological wall between two intelligences that must not meet. And I had cracked it open. "The survey team," I said. "They didn't fall. They were pulled down toward whatever built those fissures, whatever's been digging upward for, I don't even know how long. And from the seaside, the sound's getting closer every night." Garrett left the next morning. He didn't say much. He shook my hand at the car and held it for a moment longer than necessary and said, "I'll do what I can from the inside, but Breck, if the headland stops singing, if the barrier frequency drops, you need to leave." I told him I understood. That was May 1st, 10 days ago. In the 10 days since, the following has happened. The cracks in the compressor room floor have widened to approximately 15 centimeters. I can see down into them now, see the first few meters of the fissure walls, smooth and regular, descending into darkness. The layered sound from below is now audible outside the building at all hours, not just at night. And the answering sound from the sea has moved. It's closer. I can hear it during the day now. A faint, complex tone that seems to come from everywhere on the water simultaneously. The headland's barrier frequency has not dropped. If anything, it's intensified further. I can no longer place my hand on any stone surface without feeling it. A vibration so deep and powerful that prolonged contact leaves my fingers numb. The cottage walls vibrate. The lighthouse tower vibrates. The cliff path vibrates. Every stone surface on Dunmore Point is participating in the barrier now, as if the entire headland is being recruited for a defense it was always designed to provide, but has never been pushed to deliver at this intensity. 3 days ago, a fishing vessel from Carrickmore entered the Dunmore approaches in heavy fog. I watched it from the cliff edge. As it passed within a mile of the headland, it adjusted course, sharply, suddenly, veering northeast and accelerating away at full speed. I spoke to the skipper later at the harbor. His name was Donal. He said he'd heard the foghorn, the protective tone, the guiding frequency, and it had told him to turn, not in words, not in any way he could articulate. He said it was like the sound had a shape, and the shape said, "Go, now, away." He also said something else. He said that, as he turned, he looked south, toward the open water beyond the headland, and he saw the surface of the sea moving, not waves, not current, the surface itself distorting as if something enormous was pressing against it from below. He said it was only there for a moment, only visible at the edge of the fog bank where the light caught the water at the right angle. But he said the area of distortion was larger than his vessel, larger than anything he'd ever seen in 40 years of fishing. He said he won't go near Dunmore Point again. Last night, the night of May 10th, I stood on the cliff edge at 3 a.m, and I heard both sounds reach a new intensity. The layered exchange from below and the response from the sea were now running in perfect synchronization, not alternating, simultaneous, a harmony. The two voices had found each other's frequency and were singing together, in unison, the barrier's constant hum, the only thing between them. And the barrier was thinner. I could feel it. Not quieter. The volume hadn't changed, but thinner, like a note held too long, growing bright and brittle, like a wire vibrating at a frequency just below its breaking point. I don't know what happens when it breaks. I don't know if what's below the headland and what's beyond the shelf are two parts of something that was separated, or two enemies held at bay from each other, or two halves of a communication that has been building toward a conclusion for geological ages. I don't know if their meeting would be catastrophic or beautiful or simply incomprehensible, something so far outside human experience that witnessing it would be like watching two galaxies collide from the inside. I know only this. I was given a system to maintain, and I failed to understand it. The diaphone was cruel. It inverted the barrier and killed people, and stopping it was the right thing to do. But the fissures should have been left sealed. The cracks I opened were not release valves. They were not freedom for something caged. They were structural damage to a wall that had held for longer than human civilization. And now, the wall is singing at its highest frequency, and the two things it separates are singing back. And somewhere in the mathematics of resonance and stress and material fatigue, there is a moment approaching, inevitable, when the wall cannot hold any longer. I am staying because someone should see it, because the record matters, even if no one reads it, because Arthur Prade stayed for 27 years, and I owe him at least the dignity of witness. The headland is humming. The sea is answering. The fissures are widening. And somewhere in the dark water beyond the continental shelf, something is rising, not toward the surface, but toward the shore, toward Dunmore Point, toward the other voice that has been calling it home through 30 meters of fractured rock and a barrier that grows thinner every hour. I have stopped trying to understand what they are. I have stopped trying to determine if this is danger or reunion. I have stopped asking whether I should flee. I am the keeper of Dunmore Point, the last one. And when the headland's voice finally breaks, when the wall between them fails, and two things that should never meet come together on this cliff in the dark, I will be here. Not because I can stop it, because someone has to hear what they say to each other, and because, God help me, part of me wants to know,